My friends, welcome back to Eternal Flame Wisdom. Today I want to tell you about one single day that quietly rewrote the rest of my life. It was not a dramatic day. Nothing tragic happened. No one shouted at me. No one betrayed me. Nothing collapsed around me. And yet, that ordinary afternoon after I had already crossed 60 years of age became the hinge on which everything turned. For most of my life, I had been a person who needed to be understood. I needed people to see my intentions clearly. I needed them to approve of my choices, my work, my parenting, my silence, my words, even my mistakes. I did not realize how heavy that need had become until the day I finally put it down. And when I put it down, I felt something I had not felt in decades. I felt light. I felt like myself again. So today, I want to walk you through what happened, and what changed in me afterward. Not because my story is special, but because I believe many of you carry the same invisible weight I carried for 60 years. You do not need to accept every part of what I say. Take what fits your life, and leave the rest behind. This is not a lecture. It is simply one old man's honest account of the day he finally stopped asking the world for permission to be himself. The first thing I noticed was how tired I had become from performing. For years, I had two versions of myself. One version lived quietly inside me, and the other version stood in front of people, adjusting itself constantly to fit their expectations. That day, I realized the performing version of me had been running the show for far too long, and the real one had barely been given a stage. Approval is expensive. You pay for it with pieces of your true self, one conversation at a time. The second thing I understood was that approval had never actually made me feel safe. I used to believe that if enough people agreed with me, I would finally relax. But every time I received approval, the relief lasted only a few days before the anxiety returned, searching for its next dose. That was the moment I understood approval is not medicine. It is a craving disguised as reassurance. The third realization came when I asked myself an uncomfortable question. Whose voice was I actually trying to please? When I looked closely, I found old voices from childhood, disguised as new faces. A teacher who once criticized me. A parent who rarely said I was enough. A sibling who compared me to someone else. I had spent 60 years trying to win arguments with people who were no longer even in a room. The fourth thing I faced was the fear hiding underneath the need for approval. I had always told myself I simply valued harmony, that I simply wanted people to feel comfortable around me. But the truth was sharper than that. I was afraid that if people disapproved of me, it would prove something terrible about my worth. That day, I finally saw the fear for what it was, and fear that is seen clearly begins to lose its grip. The fifth shift happened when I stopped mistaking silence for disapproval. For years, if someone did not respond the way I expected, I assumed I had failed them somehow. But silence is not always judgment. Sometimes silence is simply someone living their own life, thinking their own thoughts, unrelated to me entirely. Not everything is about us, and that realization was strangely freeing. The sixth change was learning the difference between respect and approval. I used to believe they were the same thing, but they are not. Respect means treating someone with dignity even when you disagree with their choices. Approval means agreeing with those choices completely. I began to understand that I could be respected by people who did not approve of everything I did, and that respect was enough to build a life on. The seventh lesson arrived when I noticed how selectively people had ever given me their approval in the first place. The same decision that earned praise from one person earned criticism from another. If approval could shift so easily depending on who was watching, then it was never a reliable measure of anything. It was simply a mirror reflecting someone else's mood, not my worth. The eighth thing I did was begin separating my decisions from other people's reactions. Before that day, if someone reacted badly to something I chose, I immediately assumed my choice was wrong. But a reaction is not proof. A reaction is simply information about the other person's perspective. My choice could still be right for my life even if it made someone else uncomfortable. The ninth realization was recognizing how much energy I had spent rehearsing conversations in my head, trying to predict how people would judge me before I even spoke. That day, I noticed this habit clearly for the first time, and I asked myself how many hours of my life had been spent inside imaginary courtrooms, defending myself against people who were not even present. The answer embarrassed me. It also freed me. The 10th thing I understood was that my children did not need a father who bent constantly to please others. They needed a father who stood steadily in his own values, so they could learn what steadiness looked like. Every time I abandoned my own judgment to gain someone's approval, I was quietly teaching the people who loved me that approval mattered more than integrity. That day, I decided to teach something different. The 11th shift came when I stopped explaining myself to people who had already decided not to understand me. For years, I believed that if I simply found the right words, everyone would eventually see my side. But some people are not looking for understanding. They are looking for confirmation of a conclusion they already reached. Explaining endlessly to someone like that does not build a bridge. It only builds exhaustion. The 12th thing I practiced was allowing people to be disappointed in me without rushing to fix it. This was one of the hardest lessons of my life. I had spent decades treating other people's disappointment as an emergency I had to resolve immediately. That day, I let disappointment simply exist in someone else's heart without treating it as my responsibility to repair. It felt uncomfortable at first, and then it felt like relief. The 13th realization was noticing how much smaller my world had become because of my need for approval. I had avoided certain hobbies because they seemed unusual. I had avoided certain opinions because they seemed unpopular. I had avoided certain friendships because others disapproved of them. Approval had been quietly editing my life for years, cutting away pieces of who I actually was. The 14th thing I learned was that the people whose approval I chased the hardest were rarely the people who truly loved me. The people who genuinely loved me accepted me long before I performed for them. It was the distant, uncertain relationships I kept trying hardest to win over, as if their approval would finally prove my worth. That day, I understood that chasing distant approval while ignoring close love was a tragic use of a lifetime. The 15th shift happened when I began to trust my own judgment again. For years, I had outsourced my confidence to other people's opinions. If they agreed with me, I felt certain. If they disagreed, I doubted myself instantly. That day, I asked myself a simple question. Have I lived long enough, and learned enough, to trust my own conclusions? The honest answer was yes, and that answer became the foundation for everything that followed. The 16th thing I noticed was how differently I began speaking once I stopped seeking approval. My words became shorter, clearer, and more honest. I no longer padded my sentences with unnecessary apologies or disclaimers designed to soften how others might perceive me. I simply said what was true, and let people respond however they needed to respond. The 17th realization was that peace and approval cannot occupy the same space for very long. Chasing approval requires constant vigilance, constant adjustment, constant monitoring of other people's expressions and tones. Peace requires the opposite. Peace requires letting go of that surveillance entirely. That day, I finally chose peace, and I understood I could not have chosen it while still holding onto the old habit. The 18th thing I did was stop apologizing for taking up space in my own life. For years, I minimized my needs, my time, and my preferences so that others would feel comfortable around me. That day, I recognized that I had spent 6 decades making myself smaller to avoid disapproval, and I decided that the remaining years deserved better than that. The 19th shift came when I understood that some relationships only functioned because I kept shrinking myself to maintain them. When I stopped shrinking, a few relationships became distant, and that was painful to accept. But I also understood that a connection which only survives on my constant self-erasure was never truly a connection to begin with. It was simply an arrangement, disguised as closeness. The 20th thing I learned was that approval seeking often masquerades as kindness. I used to tell myself I was simply being considerate, simply avoiding conflict, simply keeping the peace. But real kindness does not require abandoning yourself completely. There is a version of kindness that includes honesty, even when honesty creates temporary discomfort. That day, I chose that harder, truer kindness. The 21st realization was recognizing how much lighter my body felt once I released this need. I had carried tension in my shoulders for years without understanding why. Once I stopped bracing for other people's judgment, that tension slowly began to disappear. I had not realized how physical the cost of approval seeking had been until I finally set it down. The 22nd thing I practiced was allowing myself to disagree openly, without softening it into something unrecognizable. For most of my life, if I disagreed with someone, I buried the disagreement under layers of gentle phrasing until it barely resembled disagreement at all. That day, I allowed myself simply to say, "I see this differently," and let those words stand on their own without excessive cushioning. The 23rd shift happened when I stopped measuring my life against other people's applause. Success, for most of my years, meant hearing enough people say I had done well. That day, I redefined success as something quieter. Success became waking up in alignment with my own values, regardless of whether anyone noticed or clapped. The 24th thing I understood was that my time on this earth was shrinking, while my need for approval had been treating time as if it were endless. Once I truly accepted how limited my remaining years were, seeking approval from uncertain people suddenly felt like an absurd use of something so precious. That awareness alone dissolved years of old habits almost overnight. And the 25th, the final lesson from that day, was this. I finally understood that my worth had never actually been undecided. I had simply been waiting for permission to believe something that was already true. I did not need anyone's approval to be worthy of respect, worthy of love, or worthy of peace. I only needed to stop asking the question in the first place. My friends, since that day, my life has not become perfect. I still face disagreements. I still encounter people who misunderstand my choices. I still occasionally feel the old pull to explain myself more than necessary. But something fundamental shifted permanently. I no longer build my sense of self on the shifting ground of other people's opinions. I build it on my own steady understanding of who I am, earned through 60 years of living, failing, learning, and finally choosing myself. If you are watching this and you recognize that same exhausting need inside yourself, I want you to know something important. It is never too late to put it down. You do not need a dramatic event to release it. Sometimes it simply takes one honest afternoon, one quiet moment of clarity, one decision to finally stop asking the world for permission to exist as you are. Thank you for spending this time with me here at Eternal Flame Wisdom. If these words touch something inside you, I hope you carry a little more freedom into your day. Be gentle with yourself, trust your own judgment, and remember that your worth was never something anyone else was ever qualified to decide. Take care of yourselves, my friends. I will see you again soon.